Hi there, U.S. historians. So today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction and Segregation to set up the Civil Rights Movement. So our song for today is Glory by John Legend and Common. Okay. Like I said, definitely take notes on this. Okay. So our topic, we're going to look at the era known as Reconstruction, which is after the Civil War. Okay, so Reconstruction, just like what it sounds like, to construct, to build, and to do again. Okay, this attempt to dismantle the power structures of the South and build anew. Okay, the other key term you definitely need to know is segregation. Okay, so segregation, what that means is separating a group of people based on their race. Okay, so previously I had you look at the abolitionist movement, and I'm guessing a lot of you guys probably picked either running away from slavery or helping freed slaves or education. Okay, but kind of the ironic thing is really what ends slavery is violence. Okay, the Civil War. Okay, so what's going to happen? The South will secede from the Union, meaning to leave, okay, and start their own country known as the Confederate States of America. Okay, now the North is like, whoa, 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 whoa! You can't just start your own country. Okay, they thought that this was unconstitutional. Okay. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, the North, early in the Civil War, they don't think that this war, that they're fighting to end slavery. They'll often, historians will say that they were fighting to preserve the Union, to keep the country together. Okay. And Southerners, as you see on the right-hand side here, most Southerners did not own slaves. Okay. Slaves were very expensive. Okay. So it's kind of a symbol of wealth and status in the South to own slaves. Okay, but regardless, Southerners thought that they were fighting this to preserve their way of life. Okay, they recognized that their whole economy depended on slavery, that the election of Abraham Lincoln threatened that. Now, let me be clear, the singular cause of the Civil War is slavery. Okay, you look at the secession notes from any of the states that secede, they mention slavery several times. Okay. So South Carolina will secede from the Union in 1860, and then in the following months, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida will follow suit. Okay, as we continue, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas will as well. Okay, now this is not the focus of today is not the Civil War, but one of the key terms you definitely need to know is the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so emancipation, what that literally means is freedom. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln issues this 2 years into the war, saying that he's proclaiming freedom for all slaves who are rebelling, that live in states that are rebelling against the Union. Okay, so the wording of that matters here. Okay, oftentimes historians or just Americans in general lift Abraham Lincoln up as this great emancipator, this fighter for freedom. Okay, now this is 1863, so this is 2 years into the Civil War before he issues this proclamation. Okay, so a couple important things to note as far as the wording. Okay, he doesn't free slaves in the border states, states that stayed with the Union and did not leave the country. Okay. Also, he said, him saying, hey, southern states, you guys over there, free your slaves, they're not going to listen to him. Okay, the Confederate states are like, you are not our president. We're not going to free any slaves. So it's important to note the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free any slaves. Okay, so why the heck does it matter? Okay, well, one, this changes the purpose of the war. Okay, this war is no longer just about restoring the country, but now there's no way this war can end without getting rid of slavery. Okay, and then number two, as the Union troops, troops from the North, conquer areas in the South, they are now freeing those slaves. So they become like this force that's freeing an entire race of people. Okay, so I'm assuming okay, I'm just really quickly going over the Civil War, that the North wins the Civil War. Okay, you should have learned that in middle school. Okay, but now that the war is over, they have to decide how do they want to rebuild the South. Okay, so in order for the South to rejoin the country, they have to adopt these three amendments here. So the first one, the 13th Amendment, again, a key term that I'd certainly write down, is very simple. It abolishes slavery. Okay, now adding an amendment to the Constitution is a big deal. Okay, you are fundamentally changing our structure of rights that are allowed. Okay, we're not just talking about laws here, we're talking about changing our founding document. Okay, so slavery now is out of the question. Okay, now just because African Americans are now free doesn't necessarily imply equality. Okay, keep in mind women don't have a lot of the same rights as men at this time. Okay, so the 14th Amendment redefines what it means to be a citizen. Okay, it says if you're born in the United States, you are now an American citizen, which implies then as citizenry that you are entitled to all the rights guaranteed under the Constitution. Okay, so one element that they put in here is what's called the Equal Protection Clause. What this means is essentially is equality under the law. Okay, you have to be equally protected. So what does that mean? You know, if someone was to commit an act of violence against you, the police are expected to protect you just like they would any citizen. Okay? If a person commits a crime, their punishment cannot be drastically more severe than someone else. Okay? Keep that in the back of your mind here because we'll look at abuses of that system. Okay? And then the 15th Amendment, you would think that getting all the rights under the Constitution implies voting, okay? But they felt they needed to go a step further. Okay? In 1868, you're going to see a huge influx of African Americans registering to vote. Okay? They want to participate in democracy. They want political power. Okay? But southern states are just not going to allow it. Okay? So during Reconstruction, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which pretty much said, and again, the wording here is very important, that no one can prevent you from voting based on your race. Okay? So trying to kind of provide further protections for voting, for African Americans to have political power. And you will see African Americans during this time period, following the Civil War, becoming politicians, getting political power. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean then, just because Congress passes these amendments, that racism is gone. Okay, the South, like white Southerners, still want to keep their power. So they're going to create these three things to limit African Americans' ability to vote. Okay, the first one is the poll tax. That one's pretty straightforward. Very simply, it says you have to pay a tax in order to vote. Okay, now this also discriminates against poor whites. Okay. So the next one that's passed is the grandfather clause. This one's pretty clever here. Okay? What it says is if your grandfather could not vote before January 1st, 1867, you cannot vote. Okay? Now keep in mind, African Americans did not have full voting rights before this date. So they're not saying, no, you can't vote because of your race. They're saying, no, 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 you can't vote because of your grandfather. Okay? And the last one are literacy tests. Okay? So these are tests, reading tests that you were required to take if you could not prove a 5th grade education. Okay? And you had to pass in order to vote. Now, for the most part, this only really applies to African Americans because they were fundamentally denied an education prior to this. Okay? If you had passed a 5th grade education, you didn't have to take this test. Okay? Also, the people giving these tests were primarily white. So they would intentionally skew the results to prevent African Americans from passing this. Okay, they would grade them more harshly. Okay, so the Supreme Court case, there's two that you definitely need to know. The first one is Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so what this said here was separate but equal. Okay, so this is a political cartoon here making fun of that concept. Okay, because yes, there are two water fountains, but clearly they are not equal. Okay, so segregation, okay, Plessy versus Ferguson is a Supreme Court decision passed in 1896 that said it is okay to segregate and have separate facilities so long as they are equal. Okay, that this did not violate the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. Okay, from the Southerners' perspective, they're thinking, okay, well, blacks and whites in the South, they don't like each other, so let's just keep them separate to limit violence. Okay, but as you can see from the picture here, it's very clearly not going to be equal in implementation. Okay, so the South is going to segregate just about everything. Okay, so housing, entire neighborhoods will be exclusively all white or all black. Okay, schools, restaurants. Okay, employment, I would say, is a big one here because it's perfectly legal at this time to not hire someone because of their race. Okay, it's happening quite often in the South. The other one that I threw up here, because there's so many that I could put on here, is cemeteries. Okay, so keep this in mind here. So in the South, you're born into a segregated hospital. Okay, you go to segregated schools, you live in segregated neighborhoods. Your entire life is segregated. Okay, and then when you die, you still are segregated. So you think about why, from a religious perspective, we bury bodies, right? So that their soul can ascend to heaven. Okay, what this is implying then is that heaven is also segregated. Okay, sending a strong message in the South at this time for sure. Okay, now another topic that I'm sure you at least have heard of, okay, is the topic of lynching. Okay, I didn't want to put any. There's a lot of images of lynching. Okay, I didn't want to put any of that on here just because it's online. So what lynching actually is, it's a killing by a mob, usually for a suspected crime. Okay, now this is inherently problematic. Okay, the example that the students are most familiar with is Emmett Till. Okay, oftentimes they will accuse someone of a crime. Okay, and the targets are almost always African Americans. Okay, well, if that's the case, it's the court system that's supposed to execute them. Okay, they have to go through a trial, have to be presented with evidence, have a jury of their own peers, have a lawyer defend them, okay, and then be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, and then even still may not be executed. Okay, the sentence may not be execution. Okay, so lynchings, you can pretty much infer that the victims of these lynchings are almost always innocent. Okay, that it's really not about whatever crime that they say. It's usually accused of either raping white women or murder. Okay, but really it's usually about targeting or challenging white supremacy. Okay, Emmett Till, for example, was accused of whistling at a white woman. Okay, so these are particularly atrocious and awful acts of violence that are going to happen throughout the South. Okay, so oftentimes historians wonder, like, how could this be so systemic? How could this go on for so long? Okay, well, several sociological ways of interpreting this. One is group psychology. Okay, that this was the norm. Okay, the second was no fear of punishment. Okay, the police are oftentimes members that are doing this acts of violence as well. Okay, the third is this idea of racism, this belief that they're inferior. Okay, that it's easier to commit acts of violence if you view someone as lesser. Okay, and then the fourth one here, throughout pop culture at this time, they're going to stereotype and try and portray African Americans as dangerous. This is a stereotype that's going to persist throughout. During slavery, that's how they justified slavery, saying this is a violent group that needs to be controlled. Okay, during segregation, while they African Americans, specifically African American men, want to seek revenge for this white supremacy, so they need to be controlled. Okay, so how groups are portrayed in the media is incredibly important. Okay, because that's where these stereotypes are coming from. They don't really see each other that often because of segregation. Okay, so in class, oftentimes what we look at then is segregation today. Okay, so what this is a map that was put together using the 2010 census, and they made every single person a dot based on their ethnicity, their race. Okay, so this is Chicago. Okay, modern day, the most recent data, 2010. Okay, you can see the south side of Chicago still primarily African American. Okay, southwest side primarily Hispanic. This red little area right here, this is Chinatown. Okay, and the north side pretty white. Okay, so this is actually an interactive Google map. Okay, where you can zoom in on any portions of the country. So certainly you can zoom in on Mundelein and compare it to neighboring towns. Okay, let's see if this will do this here. I highly recommend to add the map labels. Okay, so you can kind of see where we're looking. Okay, and you can kind of compare. So this area right here is Mundelein. Okay, pretty diverse. Okay, but as you move further westward, okay, primarily white. Okay, So that's something I just want to kind of leave it on. You guys are lucky to attend a high school that's very ethnically diverse, but that's not how most of America is. America is still pretty segregated, albeit not legally, but the end result still taking effect. Okay, so I'll post this link so you can kind of check out the map if you'd like on the class website. That's it for right now. Remember to stay awesome, U.S. historians, and have a great day.